The joys of lesser organisms rising up to slay their...
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Why No One Plays. Okay, this one is a bit of a special episode because you may recognize this champion already. So I did make an episode on him before, but given that it came out about 2 years ago and how it was somewhat poorly made, I wanted to remake it to match my current style of Why No One Plays. Fortunately, my viewers also want to see it remade, so without further ado, today's episode will be refeaturing Aurelion Sol, the Star Forger. And if this is your first time watching one of these videos, I want to establish that obviously people do play Aurelion Sol. I don't literally mean no one plays the champion. In case you were about to hit the comments saying, what are you talking about, I main him? The point of Why No One Plays is to bring forth discussion about what makes them not as popular a champion to the general player base, and hopefully, this video can also raise more awareness about the champion and encourage some viewers to give them a try. For those who do main Sol, I'd love to hear your own experiences with him and why you decided to choose him as your main even though very few people do. As for the rest of us, let's get on with the video. 2016, or Season 6, was an interesting year because it brought forth a lot of new and innovative designs to champions, as Aurelion Sol was released shortly after Jhin and Illaoi, which shook up the bot and top lanes. Then we had Taliyah, Kled, and Ivern in the mix as well, which broke up all conventions for pretty much every role. At the time of his release, Aurelion Sol was met with some mixed responses. There was a faction that claimed his playstyle was way too broken because he had a permanently available source of damage, while another believed his unorthodox playstyle would be too difficult to play at even a reasonable level and therefore thought no one would bother playing him. What's funny is that both happened to be right to some extent. At the time, Aurelion Sol was not only kind of janky to play but also incredibly powerful, to the point where those bold enough to put some work into him would be a terrifying sight on the Rift, mostly because no one had any idea how to counter him. And that strength would remain consistent over the years as he would almost always have a play rate above 50%. In rare cases, he would even sit at 55%, incredible for any champion to reach a statistic that high. Although some of those numbers might be inflated due to the fact that very few people play him, and those who do usually play him well. His story is a rather sad tale of a very creative champion design and an equally rewarding learning curve, even though it may be kinda strict at first. But that champion design has also permanently gated Aurelion Sol from ever seeing the spotlight in exchange for that level of power, and his playstyle completely stems from his passive, Center of the Universe. 3 stars constantly orbit the dragon, dealing magic damage to enemies that come in contact with him. It's a very simple passive on such a complex champion, wouldn't you say? As straightforward as it sounds, you have rotating orbs of damage that are constantly active around you. This is his main source of DPS, as all of Aurelion Sol's abilities are built to enable him to land as many stars on as many enemies as possible, and they always maintain position 325 units away from him, expanding up to 650 when he activates his W. He's not the first of his kind to have an external source of damage. Prior to his release, Orianna and Azir were the first 2 champions whose gameplay completely revolved around something other than themselves. The former has maintained a great deal of popularity in both solo queue and professional play, while the latter has been almost a bigger balance nightmare than our space dragon himself, and I'll cover Azir in the next episode, so stay tuned for that. But back to Aurelion Sol, this mechanic, while both fun and powerful to use, has a very unique weakness, leading to the biggest reason why people don't like to play him. Aurelion Sol is the only champion in all of League of Legends, at least to my knowledge, who is exclusively ranged. By that, I mean he literally cannot deal that much damage to targets within 325 units of his collider, a weakness that is not present in any champion before his release or since. Every other champion in the game has a maximum range of attack, as in they're only a threat with an X amount of range. Aurelion Sol has both a maximum and minimum attack range. He can only strike enemies between 325 and 650 units of him, no more or less. Despite technically being a ranged attacker, Aurelion Sol has a natural weakness to melee champions because if they can close the distance on him, his main source of damage is completely nullified, forcing him to burn what little defensive options he has just to keep them away from him. Basically, Aurelion Sol's biggest counter is dash abilities because he's all about spacing, keeping enemy threats away from him by zoning them out with his stars. While there are champions who have spacing abilities, like Darius and Aatrox, that you can counter by going closer to them so as not to take the full damage from their sweet spots, it also forces you to make a choice, to risk being in striking distance of an extremely dangerous melee champion or intentionally taking a big hit to put some distance between you and them. And that's a tough call to make since very few champions can take on bruisers in a direct one-on-one confrontation. With Aurelion Sol, without his ultimate available, his entire pressure can be thwarted simply by sitting on top of him. That being said, I don't want to sell him short, as his Q Star Surge can be used while running away from pursuers to stun them and therefore re-establish that line of scrimmage, so he does have self-peel, but against a lot of champions that may not be enough of a deterrent. Almost every ranged champion is naturally weak against melees if they get close enough because melee champions generally have higher damage, more base stats and durability, etc. But at least they can still apply damage to that target. For example, poke champions like Ziggs work best when there's a lot of space between him and his opponent, but even if they do manage to close the distance, he can still use his abilities on top of himself and they would have the same effect. Because of his orbit static minimum range, players can feel almost completely defenseless against opponents who can duck into his little friend zone without an easy self-peel tool at their disposal. Conversely, Aurelion Sol's maximum range is not that great either. Most mages can attack anywhere between 600 to 900 units such as Vel'Koz, Ahri, Victor, Syndra, Anivia, etc. Meaning while they may not necessarily win the matchup, they can pretty much outrange him altogether unless he lands a really good Q. On top of his range limitations on both sides, Aurelion Sol is one of the most awkward champions to play mechanically because you also have to space his stars. There are only 3 stars that orbit him at any given time, and they move around very slowly, allowing most champions to simply walk right through them to get to the big man himself. When using Celestial Expansion, the range of his stars double and they move a lot faster, which does make it a little more risky to play the jump rope song against him. That being said, while his Ring of Fire has really dangerous orbs that deal huge amounts of damage, it's also not a permanently active ring. To play Aurelion Sol well, you have to be very precise with your spacing to not only keep enemy champions within that 650 range, but also have them in that spacing long enough to take damage from center of the universe. Those orbiting stars also have a very small hitbox, at least if we compare them to the likes of a Darius Q, Camille W, or Aatrox Q. Early on it may not be that much of a challenge since no one has boots and everyone is kinda slow, but entering the mid to late game when mobility increases and champions become faster, it's an uphill battle for you because you're not just facing one opponent anymore. During a fight it may be 3 or more that you have to keep an eye on. Back in late Season 9, Celestial Expansion switched from a toggle to a temporary activation, which was more or less detested by many A-Sol mains because it made spacing all the more strict since you now have to make every shot count. Before, if you had enough mana to sustain the outer limit, you could afford to miss a few boops from your stars. You do not have that luxury anymore. Building Rylai's Crystal Scepter does make landing your shots more consistent, but as I mentioned in my previous episodes, it is never a good thing for items to serve to counterbalance the champion's weaknesses. They should always be meant to augment that champion's strengths. While every champion has a core build that synergizes best with them, it's important to understand that when playing a champion, the player should be incentivized to build certain items but not forced to build them. I'm sure most Aurelion Sol mains can attest to that really annoying experience of going up against a super highly mobile champion like Riven, Kha'Zix, or Akali and trying to aim your stars to hit them, but they can dip, dive, duck, dodge, dash all over the place and then explode you the moment you miss your skill shots. And speaking of enemy champions, that brings me to my next point. Since he not only loses to champions that outrange him, but champions who are faster than him, he has a lot of very egregious counters, namely champions who can easily rush past the Celestial Ring and get right up in his friend zone. Champions like Katarina, Diana, Pantheon, Kassadin, Fizz, Zed, etc. can easily shut him down with very little effort. Consequently, it makes him very unstable to main because he has so many really bad matchups. His presence in a team fight can be astronomical, no pun intended, since he does have some of the best DPS uptime in the game, but that can all be shut down if the enemy team has even one high-speed burst champion. Most hypercarries that aren't marksmen are generally melee champions, and most high-priority threats like assassins and divers are also melee champions. They specialize in getting up close and personal, and as a mid laner, you not only have to contend with your lane opponent potentially being one of those champions, but also the jungler. And between those two, there are way too many combinations of matchups that can grind you to pieces before you can even do anything about it. In teamfights, all that meticulous spacing you practiced won't matter if the enemy team has someone like Vi, Talon, or Blitzcrank who spell certain death if they get their hands on you. For the most part, Aurelion Sol's ultimate Voice of Light doesn't really do that much in terms of damage, since it has a lower base damage, range, and AP ratio to Lux's Final Spark. It's mostly meant to be a self-peel tool to knock enemies close to him away from him so he can actually deal damage with this passive. But a tiny knockback is hardly enough to stop most assassins and divers from blitzing you down, especially since it's an easily avoidable ability being a straight line. On a side note, it always struck me as odd that Voice of Light was a linear skill shot and not an AoE burst. Given the name Voice of Light, and if you understand how sound works, you would think that it expels all around him or at least even a cone in front of him, since, most roars do that. Just a personal thought, but something like Xin Zhao's ultimate makes a lot more sense on Aurelion Sol. For those of you who don't know, Xin Zhao's ultimate knocks all enemies around him a fixed distance away aside from the one he's attacking. That way, it doesn't matter where his assailants are or how many are on him, he can just press this as a get off me tool to peel everyone away and force them to his outer limit. But back to the main topic. Every champion comes with their own slew of bad matchups. I'm not saying that issue only applies to Aurelion Sol, but there's a difference between a -1 matchup where you may be at a slight disadvantage but you can still beat them if you outplay them, versus a -2 where unless they're really bad at the champion, you're not going to be able to beat them no matter how good you are. Unfortunately though, if you want to play Aurelion Sol, you have no choice but to main him. If you remember what I said about Singed, how he's a pretty bad champion to one-trick due to his egregious weaknesses against certain champions, yet to master him, it's almost obligatory to one-trick him, Aurelion Sol is much the same. Since he has such a deviant playstyle, it takes a completely different mindset and thought process to play this champion, and as you know, it's very easy to fall out of practice in League of Legends because champions are buffed, nerfed, and changed all the time to where you constantly have to stay up to date. If you noticed, whenever you see an Aurelion Sol player, or at least a half-decent one, they usually are exclusively one-tricks. That's because you have to be in order to be proficient with him. But it's risky and difficult to one-trick him because there are so many things that can completely ruin him thanks to his unique mechanics. In other words, you can't reliably have Mr. Space Dragon as a pocket pick the way you can other mid-champions like Ahri. Almost everyone in the mid lane knows how to play Ahri to at least some extent because she's a very straightforward champion. If you play other mages, you can understand her at a fundamental level. The only people who pick up Aurelion Sol are those who really love his playstyle and want to push it far. As I mentioned before, they're rewarded handsomely for their efforts, since while very difficult to get the hang of initially, he's a very strong champion to have as a main. Overcoming those weaknesses takes a lot of time investment, and while I'm sure no player would be unhappy to have an Sol on their team, no one wants to really play him either. Unlike Kled and Kindred where their difficulty stems from something they can't exactly control, for Aurelion Sol it is within their control. But it's such a strange mechanic that not many people can get used to. Players naturally are quite impatient, that's why they like champions who are easy to pick up and quick to action. Aurelion Sol's theme goes entirely against the general mentality a lot of players have. He has a lot of unique strengths but also unique weaknesses, which requires you to put a lot of upfront effort to pick him up. Generally speaking, he's not hard to play mechanically, you don't have to have insanely high APM like you would on Callista, but it's almost like while every champion entails riding a bicycle, Aurelion Sol is a pogo stick. You have to forget everything you used to know about League of Legends just to pick this guy up, and that's not a sacrifice many want to make because you either have to commit to the champion or not at all. And if we put that all together, he's just weird. He's not a bad champion, he's not an overpowered champion, he's just weird. The challenges he has to face are completely different from any other champion in the game. Conversely, there's also a lot of crazy cool things you can pull off with this guy that no other champion can. He's just a genuine one-of-a-kind guy, and while he will never ever have a pick rate above 5%, it's cool that he's in the game. In my experience, almost every Sol player does decently well. He's that champion that you don't see too often, but you also don't mind seeing him on your team. But thanks to everyone who watched all the way to the end. If you enjoyed the video, a rating would be much appreciated, and if you'd like to support my channel, best way you can do so is like the video, leave a comment, share this with your friends, and subscribe. If there's a champion I have not covered on either why no one plays or why everyone plays that you want me to work on next, consider making a donation to my Patreon page, as patrons can put in a request for a specific champion to cut the line. Aside from that, all links to my other platforms can be found in the description below, and don't forget to check out my previous episodes on why no one plays. But for now, that's it for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon for the next video. Take care.